Hey there, this is Celia. I'm going to begin to tell my Lyme story. This video, I'm going to talk about what it was like for me to have Lyme as a kid and a teenager. So let's get into it. I grew up in a Lyme endemic area, northwestern Wisconsin, in a small town with lots of woods surrounding it. There was a lot of Lyme awareness when I was a kid. I remember as early as I can, 3 or 4 years old, kindergarten, first grade for sure. I remember people telling me, like, be careful of ticks. If you see these, take them off. These are the ticks you need to be careful for. If you ever get bit, you need to tell somebody, look for these types of rashes. We need to go to the doctor if this happens. There were these tick ID cards that went out. There were stories on the news about Lyme disease and the spread of deer ticks. Anything in the newspaper. Lyme awareness was pretty high. It was almost kind of like a local hysteria. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but there was a heightened fear and awareness that I could pick up on as a kid in the adults around me. And I heard horror stories of people who had Lyme, and it was just something that I was always afraid of and aware of. Now, this Lyme awareness was not incorrect to tell me, but it wasn't the whole truth. I had a bullseye rash on the back of my left calf when I was 8. And I don't remember exactly what happened. My mom doesn't either. My best guess is that, we went to the doctor and I had probably 5 days of doxycycline. So, that was the convention at the time. So I'm assuming that's what I had. Even with the heightened awareness and the desire to nip Lyme in the bud and take care of it as soon as you can, it still wasn't sufficient, as we now know. Another thing is that a lot of people don't ever recall having a tick on them or being bit by a tick, but yet they have Lyme. Now, of course, it's more likely in an area with a lot of deer ticks, but it's not the only thing. So I don't ever remember being bit by a tick. I'm assuming that rash I had was a bullseye. You don't have to always have those things. Okay, what I want to say is you're not protected from Lyme because you didn't have a bullseye, right? So I could have been exposed to Lyme before this or after, and all of it. There's other vectors for Lyme's. Oh, I said it, Lyme's. Back home, everybody called it Lyme's disease. I look back at that with a sense of irony of wow, we were all so scared of Lyme. There was a lot of awareness about it, but yet it was hidden in plain sight. And I think back to the times in my teens, 20s, and 30s, but particularly in my 20s, why didn't the doctors think to check for Lyme? Well, the testing isn't great, so there's that, but I'll get into that in another video. And after I had the bullseye rash, I don't remember having any sort of symptoms. I don't remember having joint pain. I don't remember feeling sick or having flu-like symptoms or having a fever at all. About 6 months later, I do recall having sleep disturbance. Now, this was very noteworthy because I was an excellent sleeper as a kid. And again, speaking of irony, the irony is so thick with this one because I was known in my little hometown as being the good baby sleeper. I was infamous. And why is it ironic? Because I'm not a very good sleeper now. When I was 12, I started to have insomnia, and yeah, now I still have that. It's still a major issue. In fact, it was my first Lyme symptom, insomnia. A few years ago, as an adult, I was in the grocery store in my hometown, and this lady comes up to me, and she's like, "Oh, you're Paula's daughter, all grown up. Oh, you were the best sleeper when you were a kid. We were all amazed at you, the best baby sleeper ever." So I had quite the reputation. When I was a kid, I remember going to sleep I was like fast asleep by 7 o'clock every single night. And I probably slept until at least 7 in the morning. Yeah, I would fight to stay awake at 6:30 so I could catch glimpses of my favorite show, A Different World. Boy, did that change. So, yeah, I'm happy I was a good sleeper for my mom. Because if my kids went to bed at 7, oh my God, this world would be totally different for me. So let me back up and describe a little bit of how, again, I was saw Lyme around me and where this Lyme awareness came from. I knew many, many dogs who had Lyme and who passed away. One of my favorite dog friends died of Lyme when I was, I don't know, maybe in first grade. It was this adorable little Shih Tzu, and she probably was, yes, less than a year old. So she was super cute. And we used to play this game. So I went over to her house, my family's house, where she was a dog. And we would play this game where I would put out my hand and she would put out her paw and I would put my hand on top of it and we would go back and forth like this. I don't know what my 6-year-old brain was thinking, but that was a fun game and I'm sure that we were both in on that. So I went to go play with her and she just couldn't move. She was mopey. She looked highly uncomfortable. Maybe she was in pain, but she was just like withering away, and I was so sad. And the family told me she had Lyme and she was gonna die, and they're very sweet and supportive of me, but it just broke my heart. I just remember crying about that. And not that long after that, I saw a friend from another town that had Lyme quite bad. This was like a friend of a friend of a friend sort of thing, so I only saw them in the summer. And I always look forward to playing with her. She was one of those handful of people you meet in your whole life who are super sweet and social and fun, inclusive, happy, just an all-around genuinely friendly person. So I just loved playing with her. And so we go over there in the summertime for the first time, of this new year. And she was in a wheelchair and she was pretty nonverbal. She did say some things, but not normal child type of speaking. Her head was shaven and it looked like she had some sort of operation or, an incision or something happening back here. And her face was very tense. Her lips were in this contorted, tense look. And they told me that she had Lyme. And it was still fun to play with her. She was spunky. She still had a fair amount of energy. Her personality shone through. Her cousins and neighbors and friends, this group of people were kind of used to her at this point. And so they knew how to kind of wheel her around to be in the play. So I still enjoyed being with her, but it was a shock to know that this person had Lyme and now couldn't move and couldn't speak. The type of contorted, tense look that she had, I see it every once in a great while associated with Lyme. One of the people in the Under Our Skin documentary had that. The girl that was like a newlywed, had very severe Lyme, she had that look. It's almost like being next to them, you can just feel the level of like nerve tension that they're going through. I mean, you don't really feel because you're not them, but it's palpable. It's very obvious that there's a lot of change and discomfort. It's very abnormal. That was another time where I was taken aback by Lyme. And then it must have been the next summer that I myself was bitten by the deer tick. And I remember thinking I know people who had this and were quite bad off, but that never happened to me. So I felt lucky. I guess I didn't really think much of anything. Basically, I did the treatment and I didn't think about it again until I was 31 years old. So all that time I spent in my teens and my 20s being sick, going to the doctor and whatever, and being in pain forever, I never was like, maybe it's the Lyme. Because as far as I was concerned, and all the doctors around me and all my family, we took care of that. We did what they told us to do, and I was cured. It was like end of story. The Lyme story ended. It was never a possibility that was considered. The first symptoms that I developed, looking back, are clear as day. Although at the time, like I said, I had no idea that it was Lyme. I became very fatigued right after I turned 12, which was after 6th grade going into 7th grade. And I also had very disordered sleeping. Sleep became a big problem for me. At the same time that I became very fatigued and had the sleep problems, we got a kitten, who was adorable, and flea infested. We eradicated the fleas over the course of a few months, but there was a good 2-3 months over the whole summer where I just was covered in flea bites all the time, just constantly covered. And they were red and itchy and raised. This cat, I would play with him and he would bite me and scratch me, and the scratches would itch and hurt and be uncomfortable. I never really felt like they were infected. I never went to the doctor, but I do remember my mom kind of treating them. My mom ended up getting an infected cat scratch, and she had some symptomology about it. I don't really remember exactly what it was, nor does she. But Bartonella leads to cat scratch fever. That's where that song comes from. And Bartonella is a co-infection. You can have standalone Bartonella infection. Bartonella is implicated in with a couple different types of cancers, at least. Frank psychosis. So there is new research coming out about Bartonella as a standalone infection that needs to be addressed. And I'll link below to a medical talk where experts give a 5-minute talk about Bartonella in different situations. If you're interested in learning more about this very interesting but creepy bacteria. Now, as a co-infection, you can have some of those same symptoms, but I do think it looks a little different with coming in as a Lyme co-infection. It is more of the chronic type of Bartonella, but that also can vary widely. So there are definitely people who can relate to the Bartonella rage in particular. So that's how I believe I was exposed to Bartonella, and within a very short time I got fatigued and had disordered sleep. Like I said, I was a pretty good sleeper before this. My energy level, let's say throughout up until 6th grade, the end of 6th grade, was pretty normal for a kid. I would say I was probably 8 out of 10 of energy, just a guesstimate. 1 being can't get out of bed, 10 being all the energy you possibly could want. And then the summer after I turned 12, my energy was pretty markedly low for me. I would say it was about a 3 out of 10, sometimes a 4. The thing with having low energy is that you just never have enough, and even if you're not doing anything, you still don't have enough. There's the fatigue and the tiredness just lives in you. It's heavy, and it's this constant state of not enough. I don't feel like I have enough energy. It's just disorienting, especially for me at that time. I had no way to think about it logically or understand what was happening. And at this time, I started to form some core beliefs about myself based on how I felt. I didn't ever really think of this in any sort of clear, logical, definitive ways. I was never writing in my journal, I feel like shit, therefore I am a shitty person. I never made that blatant connection. I took it very, very personal. I could see other people around me who were like, young people going through the very beginning parts of puberty. And, you have sleep disturbances when you go through big changes, growth spurts. Teenagers need a ton of sleep when you're growing, like just a ridiculous amount. And when your brain is growing, you also need a lot of sleep. You can just sleep all the time and be tired. Like that's kind of normal, but I don't think that having a 3 out of 10 energy was certainly not normal for me. And I don't see other kids my age with that type of experience. Same with the sleep problems. I would go to slumber parties or spend the night at people's houses, and I would notice that everybody else would be able to go to sleep except me. And I would sleep fitfully through the night. And then this thing would happen where they would all get up in the morning and go eat breakfast and get ready for school and go play. And I was just became this irresponsible, this is my self beliefs running, my identity. And it was this, like I was irresponsible, I was incapable, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't smart enough, I didn't have it together enough, I was sabotaging myself, and I should just grow up and get over it. Like as if I could really control, and it's as if I wasn't really trying to fall asleep. But somehow I just really felt like it was a personal flaw, that I was so tired and I couldn't manage my sleep the way that I wanted. Which is funny because I really did try, but obviously it didn't work. At this time, I started to have preteen rebellious, angsty things that I fed into being so tired. I don't want to say that being fatigued was like a high. It wasn't quite like that, but I kind of leaned into that feeling of feeling weird, and tired, and became a little experimental about it. And I would kind of push myself to see how tired I could get or how late I could stay up. And essentially what I was doing was running on adrenaline. This was totally a time where I was funneling all of my functionality into stress hormones, fight or flight. Like that's how I taught myself how to run, because my own natural kidney adrenal function, this is kind of from a metaphorical way, I'm not talking necessarily physically, but I just was not grounded on real sustainable energy. It was about running on adrenaline, basically. That was the only way I could get myself to do anything. I became a procrastinator, probably because I was so tired, but also because there's a bit of adrenaline that runs procrastination. It just was a weird time, and that was all I had was stress hormones to run my whole energy expenditure. That was it. So I leaned into it. At this time, I remember some of my friends and I would see how late we could stay up or how long we could stay up. In 7th grade, we would try to stay up for 2 straight days. And we were like in a friend's super dank, moldy, frigid basement, listening to copious amounts of Stone Temple Pilots and The Offspring. Like, I'm sure that was not good for my health, right? Like, this just adds insult to injury. And also at this time, I started to binge read trashy novels, like all these V.C. Andrew books and Jackie Collins that I would get at the local flea market. Things we did before smartphones. I'm sure that didn't help, right? I just kind of fed into that cycle. When I was 14, I entered into the world of pain. And that has been a companion for quite some time. And I say it like that with such emphasis because the pain moved in to my life and it just stuck around and I became very enmeshed with it. And again, I never really sat down and elucidated a clear hierarchical structure of my relationship with pain and how it impacted me and what I felt about myself and my life and my path. And I never really spelled it out, but it was there. I kind of hesitate to say that I had a relationship with pain because I don't want to imply that anybody's codependent on pain. There are very little secondary gains you get from being in chronic pain. Like, it just sucks, and most people want to get out of that. And I think a lot of suffering is not necessary and preventable. So I'm not here to glamorize this relationship I had with pain and say it was fundamental to my identity or life path or anything. There is another part of me, however, that sees that pain is part of the human experience that everybody has to go through. And this was a time that I did become into a relationship with pain and what I was going to do about it. It was just something I had to cope with and deal with. It's really hard to describe. I'm getting into the metaphorical world. It reminded me that like I was not going to have an easy, normal body health life. It was like, okay, now I'm in this body that feels this way, and I'm going to have to find a way to work with it. And the skills that I had to work with that were not very good. First of all, I didn't know how to talk about the pain, and I would hide it. I did go to the doctor and I talked to my mom and different things, but it felt useless, you know. I started to really silence myself. I mean, what would I have said? Just like told my friends, like, I'm in pain. Like, what are they supposed to do? I don't really know what it was, but I felt almost like I had to create a life that was pain-free, you know, and then pretend like I lived in it. Let me get back to the pain symptoms, because that's important for my Lyme story. I was 14. I remember pretty much the time that my feet started to hurt. It was April of 1997. I worked at this little tiny grocery store in this small town I lived in, aptly named the Little Store. So I worked on my feet, and I had these ill-fitting shoes, and I just thought like I stood on my feet too much, I guess, and the floor was hard, and therefore your feet hurt. Isn't that normal? But the thing is that the pain moved in, and then it just never ever got better. It hurt every single minute of every single day. I never didn't have the pain. Like, when I wasn't working, my feet still hurt. When I was sleeping, my feet still hurt. When I woke up, my feet still hurt. If I massaged my feet and took 20 baths and, you know, whatever, they still would hurt. No matter what I did, it was unrelenting and very confusing to me. I developed a way to get around the feet pain, which was, well, I developed two ways. One was to stand on the outside of my feet. Now, I'm an acupuncturist. I don't really talk about that on here, but so I like to work with the body, and I've done a little bit of body work. That's not my main focus, but it is not good, people, to not stand on your feet the way that they are meant. Like, if you see kids and they're like walking on the edge of their feet, like, you need to correct that. Like, that's not what your feet are designed to do. Otherwise, we would walk on the edge of our feet. So I did that, and that has really messed up my body to this day. Because at 14, I was still growing in you know, adolescence. And so my body grew while my foot was just turned this weird way. So that's what I would do anytime I had to stand in line at school. When I was working for hours at a cash register, I would just stand like that. And I was hyperflexible. In fact, a lot of people think that I have ED, but I don't. Not eating disorder, but the connective tissue disorder. But I am flexible, and my joints have always been very hypermobile, even when I was a little kid. And my daughter is the same. So I think that's just how we roll with my genetics or something. So I could stretch my ankles super far and stand on the outside of my feet. Another thing I did was I never walked on my heels. I would only walk on my toes. This was anywhere I was walking. Anywhere, whatever. Walking in the grocery store, walking at school, walking down the street, walking in my house. barefoot, shoes on, wintertime. Until I was about 20 years old, from 14 till 20, I just walked on my toes. I hardly ever put my heels down because my heels is where I had the most pain. So I had, later on when I went to the doctor in physical therapy, they said I had plantar fasciitis and a migrating fat pad and heel spurs. Well, actually just one heel spur on one foot. So that's what they told me I had. And I just did not want to put any pressure on my heel. That totally has messed up my feet. And I've spent many years in physical therapy trying to get some movement in my calves. Holy moly, that has messed up my knees, my pelvis, my back, my head, my chest, everything. So that was definitely a red flag. If you know kids that like can't walk on their feet because they hurt too much, like that is something we need to address. The time where I got the heel pain, that was the month of April. I also started to have extremely excruciating dysmenorrhea at that same time. Now, dysmenorrhea or menstrual cramps is not part of the Lyme picture or the co-infection picture, but I really cannot help but wonder if there's an overlap just in the fact that having Lyme, the co-infections, could exacerbate a naturally painful tendency that I had. So my family has a number of people that would have really bad cramps that were cured with childbirth. And that was what happened to me too. So it is a family pattern, but I cannot help but wonder. Because think about it, my foot pain started the same time that my menstrual cramps got really, really horrendous. It was like the pain that I had just got ramped up. Another thing is that I've noticed that now when I take certain supplements or medicines, what I'm using for body pain and joint pain and inflammation, that really helps my menstrual cramps. It's just all related. It's just pain coming in and just going wild. The menstrual cramps were really, really challenging for me. In fact, I would say that's the most painful experience that I have had in my body, even more than the 3 months of chronic migraines that I had. Full body migraines, I would still take a triple migraine any day to having the level of dysmenorrhea that I had. It just was horrible. Labor. I have had 2 natural births. I'm going to say that labor, for me, was easier than the type of menstrual cramps that I had. Because in labor, you get a break. In menstrual cramps, you just are in pain for like 6 hours to 3 entire days, And having the menstrual cramps, the severe dysmenorrhea really made it hard for me to be in my body. I'm going to have to do a whole nother video on this, but it definitely helped. It was a contributing factor to the fact that I was really challenged by pain. The dysmenorrhea gave me the message that my body happens to be messed up. I didn't necessarily think it was unfair. I was never like, other people have normal bodies. Like, why do I have pain? It's not fair. I kind of understood that, like, well, some people have other diseases that are worse and some people don't. And some of us are in the middle and some people have problems in other areas of their life, and mine just happens to be with my body. And it just became this thing I had to deal with. And so it's very stacked on top of the Lyme experiences that I've had. Something happened at the time that I started having the foot pain. And that is, I lived in a moldy basement apartment. We had moved there a few months prior. And in the Midwest where I grew up, it's super hot in the summer and very, very humid. And that is when mold becomes a problem. So just when the temperatures started to rise and the heat was starting to be turned off, but yet it was still kind of rainy, like at the end of April, that's when mold starts to come in. It reaches its peak in the summertime for sure. But I totally was exposed to mold. And if you've been in the chronic illness world, then you don't have to dig very far to know that mold can be a big deal for a lot of people. Some people have problems dealing with mold from a genetic standpoint. Can't break it down or detox it. You'd have a lot of people exposed to mold, but some people have an extremely challenging time with it, more than others. I don't know if I am that type of genetic person. I've never done any testing like that, but I don't need to take any tests like that because I know that my whole room, my basement bedroom, was like a mold place. Like there would be mold growing on the wall, underneath the bed, on the carpet, where I was sleeping. I remember in the summer taking out a piece of paper from underneath my bed, and it was like totally like a wet noodle. It was like a damp paper towel. It was just sopped up water, and you could see through it. It was clear, translucent, with just absorbing so much moisture. And if paper was left on the floor, after a while it would start to grow mold on stalks. It just, and that was probably just spraying, you know, and I'm inhaling it while we're sleeping. So mold is a big issue, and yeah, the Toxic book by Dr. Neal talks about this, so I'm going to link to that below. There are some overarching commonalities between Lyme and the co-infections and things like mold and whatnot, but you know, you got to figure out what works for you, and just because I say something doesn't mean that is the way it is. You know, this is just my own sort of deal. Speaking of Lyme and co-infections having some patterns, the type of foot pain I had is very much associated with Bartonella. Bartonella is also associated with shin pain, like shin splints. I've heard so many stories of people who had Lyme as a kid, often undiagnosed for quite some time. And the main problem that they had with their body, their main symptom, was shin splints. At that time, I didn't have shin splints. I had just the crazy foot pain. Later on, I've had shin splints and shin problems. In fact, I'm dealing with it right now, as I have been for the last 5 years. But it's getting better. That's for another story. When I was 16, another type of pain moved in, and that was I had wrist pain and hand pain. Essentially, I had carpal tunnel, and over the course of a couple years, I lost the functionality of my left wrist. I mean, I could still use it, but I had to quit gymnastics because I couldn't use my left wrist. Like, I would grip the bar and I couldn't let it go, or I would put my hands to do a handstand, and this one would like lift off and this one was just stuck. It was like glued to the floor. I just lost the nerve. I don't know what. It just couldn't really use it. When I would drive a car, I would stick my elbows through the steering wheel and like drive like with my forearms or like this. Yeah, so everything became really hard with that. I remember the day that my wrist started to hurt. I was going to this gymnastics gym during the summertime. I was not a good gymnast, by the way. I just got to say that. And it's related to this Lyme story. People sometimes, especially when I was younger, they would look at me because I'm short, and just because of my posture, people would think like, oh, you must have been a good gymnast. And, you know, I'm flexible. And I was like, no, I was the worst gymnast on the team. First of all, I was scared of heights. And second of all, I had no power. I was very, 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 very anemic. So looking back, yeah, that was a deal. But when I was younger, I was able to jump on the springboard to like go on the vault or like mount onto the beam. And I could jump on the springboard and make a sound and like bounce on it. When I was 14, I lost all of that power. I could try as hard as I could, and I could never even make the springboard make a sound. It was gone. All of my power just got like, it was a rug that got taken out from under me. I was so mystified that happened. And yeah, looking back, that's totally an anemic thing. I mean, it also could be related to Lyme and the co-infections. So something to keep in mind if you know young people who are menstruating, like just, you losing blood, first of all, and suddenly are super lethargic, like looking to getting those iron levels and ferritin levels checked and supplement the heck out of that. Back to me getting wrist pain. So I was in this gym and we had to do handstands up against the wall while we were waiting for like some sort of apparatus. We had to do them on this small strip of concrete. There was a gap between like a mat and the wall. And normally we would do handstands, I would do them on concrete or floor or the ground and it wouldn't bother me. But somehow in the middle of that handstand, it just started to ache and hurt. It was like an acute injury. Both of my wrists went like crickle, crickle, crack, crack, crack. And they got an intense pain. And I stayed in the handstand for a little bit longer and then I just had to get out. And I was like, oh man, that hurt. It's like I kind of broke my wrist just doing that handstand there. And it never got better. It didn't get better when I got home. It didn't get better the next day. That pain instantly started and it stayed there. And I am emphasizing this because that's totally a pattern for me. And I do believe a pattern for Lyme and the co-infections. Pain comes in that seems normal, like, hey, I was working on my feet, wearing shoes that are kind of crappy. Of course my feet would hurt. But you would suspect for normal people without Lyme and the co-infections for that pain to go away after you put your feet up, soak them for a while, give them a massage, whatever. And it didn't happen for me. That pain stayed there for 6 years until I found something to help get rid of it. And my wrist pain stayed for 4 years straight, not a single day or minute or hour or evening without the pain. It just moved in and was constantly like, it's like pain get ramped up and now we're just here. We're just constantly at a high level of pain. It never resolves itself. It's always in a cycle and you never get off of the pain merry-go-round. It just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. All right, so around the time when I was 16, I started another major Lyme issue for me that involves a lot of colds and flus and infections and anything and everything that's going around. I'm gonna get it. Okay, so I got a cold, which I did fairly regularly anyways, but this cold stayed for 13 months. And I know because I wrote in my journal at the top of every month, like, oh my gosh, it's been a month since I got this cold. Oh my God, it's been 2 months. It's been 3 months. It's been 13 months. So looking back, do you really think that was a cold or was it a chronic sinus infection, chronic bronchitis? I did actually have chronic bronchitis at that time. Could have been mono, because I always had a sore throat. So basically I would just get sick a lot. And this is when it started. I do believe that the mold was a major contributing factor to that because I had so much lung and respiratory things. Like the mold can do pretty much anything to the body, but the ciliary systems are going to be implicated with that just because you're breathing it in, there's contact happening. Yeah. I also lived in a smoking household and my mom smoked, forever. And so I was always inhaling that. My lung function is really bad ever for the whole time. Like even as a tiny kid, I could hardly run or breathe. So that definitely added insult to injury. So during the last couple years of high school, I had this forever cold. I was always barking. Like when I laughed or exhaled. I got ear infections. My ears were constantly clogged. Like I couldn't hear out of it, it would just be gum ear. And then I had pneumonia when I was 16. I had it again after I graduated high school. So that just started a big pattern for me. And it goes on until this day. There have been some times where I've worked on my immunity to these sorts of things and I have gotten better, but I just see a big chronic cold equals Celia's Lyme symptoms. There's one more thing that happened in high school that I want to bring up. It is part of my own Lyme tendencies. Looking back, I can see this as something like, oh yeah, that's where it started. And I became really reactionary. Now, the first time I reacted to something, I didn't notice it. I didn't even really know what to think of it because it hadn't happened before. Now, when I was little, I actually had hives when I ate strawberries. This was before I had Lyme, so I can't necessarily blame it on that, but I definitely had like a histamine type personality. I could see how getting Lyme would ramp up that process to become just very reactionary. The reactions to things being really like chemically sensitive and sensitive to all sorts of things, that came more in my 20s. It became glaringly obvious. But I do believe it started right after I turned 18. Now, because this is YouTube and it's 2022 and it's COVID times, I'm going to say this in a code word because I don't want to raise any ire on YouTube right now. So I had a reaction to a Vaseline. You know what I'm talking about? Looking back, I just see in big red words like undiagnosed Lyme. Like my body reacted very aberrantly. I got really sick with throwing up. My eyes turned a little yellow, and that's when I was like, oh, I bet it is this liver-related Vaseline that I had yesterday that's making me sick. So I went in and I got better. Basically, I was just vomiting a lot, kind of in like a spasm about it. But I had some fluids and I recovered. So it wasn't anything severe. Within a couple days, I broke out in acne, and I had a few pimples like every month. I was never perfectly clear skinned, but just like 1 or 2 right before my period, basically, maybe 3, but nothing crazy when I was a teenager. Acne was not a major problem. Of course, I thought that any pimple was a problem, but it was nothing compared to what happened. And that is, I just had this acne that just went whoopsh, all across my cheeks, just constantly red. And I got on a number of medications for that, and that was not a really good fit for me. It was actually quite bad, which I'll get into in my next story. Another thing that happened like right a few days after I had this reaction is I became very depressed. And I don't think it was only because of this reaction, but I do believe it was very much exacerbated by it. And I take a big sigh because I'm entering into this kind of mythical, symbolic experience with my health. And that is, I would say this was probably one of the first baby health crises that I had, where I would have a health crisis where multiple areas of my body were having reactions and problems and sicknesses and what have you. And I also was having an emotional, a mental, and or a spiritual crisis at the same time. So it's like all areas of my body were just like, we are now having a crisis on every level. And that was very, very common for me. So I don't want to imply that like Lyme is a spiritual path. Like, please don't let me imply that at all, right? Just because I had some spiritual experiences or emotional experiences related to being very sick, I don't think that there's like a grand spiritual purpose, and I certainly don't think that you get sick solely because of spiritual or emotional things. Like, we don't manifest this sort of thing or bring it on ourselves. I just want to be really clear about that, because even for me, that I do sometimes feel in my health like stress, trauma, emotional pain, mental anguish, suffering, spiritual and energetic things that are going on with me can have a direct impact on my health, but it's not the only way. And I think part of the relationship between having spiritual and emotional mental crises on top of something very uncomfortable happening to my physical body is that I was trying to find a way to cope, and if things feel really big to me, I may look for tools outside of myself on a different realm to give me comfort and to help. For instance, during this time where I became depressed, I suddenly just kind of fell into my lap the idea of working with emotions. And I went to this ladies' luncheon type of thing back in Minnesota. I grew up on the border, so some Wisconsin people don't know this word, but there were luncheons where you would get hot dishes. So I'd go to the hot dish luncheon with my grandma and my aunts, and there was a book sale there. And because it was around my birthday, I always got to pick out like a few books. And I picked out this time, right after I turned 18, this book on emotions. And it is supposed to be kind of a self-help type of book. I think there were questions in there, like to reflect. You know, you'd read a section about like, this is what guilt is. Here's shame, and here's sadness and despair and whatever, and then you could reflect upon it. For me, it was really educational. It was basically a top-down approach where I was giving myself an emotional vocabulary, in which I didn't have. I really didn't, and I was really emotionally repressed. And so I looked at it as like learning about myself. I didn't know that this particular health crisis when I was 18 has this template that I could stick about 24 other health crises in there. I have a strong reaction. My body, 2 to 3 other systems of my body have a problem. And also something spiritually, emotionally, energetically, or mentally comes online, and I try to cope through it, whatever, doula myself through a really painful time. So I said when I was 18, I had pneumonia a second time. So that happened about 2 weeks after the Vaseline reaction. So I had the reaction, was, feeling bad about that. Acne a few days later, depressed a few days later, and about 1 week later, I had pneumonia. Well, first I came to like just kind of a bronchitis, like I got a cold. And then it got worse over the course of a week. And then I went into the doctor and they said I had pneumonia. And I want to bring this up because this is where I believe that Mycoplasma became a thing for me. Mycoplasma is one of the co-infections, and it's been a major biatch for me. The reason that I suspect Mycoplasma was a part of this was, well, first of all, there's many different species of Mycoplasma bacteria, and one of them is Mycoplasma pneumoniae. There's also some that go into the bladder and other areas of the body. So it is a common cause of walking pneumonia, which I had. And some people say that like a telltale sign that you may have had a pneumonia experience related to Mycoplasma in the past is that it was very antibiotic resistant. And that's what happened to me. So I was given a Z-Pak for this pneumonia that I had. And at the time I was done with it, I felt worse. Like I thought maybe I had to go in and spend the night or something. Like I was having a really hard time breathing. So I went in and they looked at my lungs and listened and all of that. And they're like, okay, we're going to give you a Z-Pak, but if you do feel worse, come in. Luckily, I'd never got any worse than that. But at the end of that second Z-Pak, I just felt marginally better. And the kind of scary thing looking back is that I think I acclimated to having these very pneumonia-like, bronchitis-like, filled, not very happy, not very functional lungs and constantly having a cold. That just became my new norm. I was nowhere near cleared from that infection. No way. I still coughed and could hardly breathe and, hard to sleep, sore throat, cold-like symptoms constantly for a number of months. But I was just like, well, I already had 2 Z-Paks. What could they possibly do for me? So I just didn't go in, and I just adapted to that level of lung dysfunction, I guess. this is the end of my talk here on what Lyme was like for me when I was a kid, a preteen, and teenager. I'm going to end here with the time before I went off to college. All right, thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.